Up next, Dr. Wills Gulsby, Assistant Professor of Wildlife Ecology and Management at the College of Forestry and Wildlife and Environment at Auburn University. His teaching responsibilities include wildlife habitat management, wildlife conservation, history, and law. He also works with the Wildlife Summer Practicum. Will's research interests include white-tailed deer ecology and management, wildlife management, habitat management, and today he's going to focus on prescribed burning that might benefit some game birds that you're aware of. So Will, come join us.
All right, I appreciate that, Tim. Good morning, everybody. How are y'all doing? So when Lee asked me to give this talk, he left it, relatively broad, and you'll even see in the agenda, I think it says something like wildlife management, if you build it, ... implying they will come. And so in determining, what to focus on for this talk, I thought through several things. I give a variety of talks like these all over the state each year. And I really wanted to hone in on fire, because I feel like fire is one of our most efficient ways of enhancing habitat for wildlife, as many of you are already aware, and it tends to be very, relatively cost effective in addition to its efficiency at managing habitat. So with that, kind of the goal of my talk today is to kind of help you think about diversifying the windows that you consider burning during, leave you with a little bit more information on how you can burn during different times of the year to better meet objectives, and then kind of maybe challenge even some of your traditional thinking on when you should or shouldn't burn. So that's the first question, right? I get from so many landowners, many of you are probably, so experienced by this point in time, you're not asking such basic questions anymore when you consult with a forester or wildlife biologist. But there are many who still are, right? How many of you in here are regularly applying prescribed fire to your property? Show of hands. Okay, so good number. How many of you feel like oftentimes you're hard pressed to get all the burning that you need to do in a given year conducted? Right? So that's a common problem too, is you just don't have enough time. And if you see it broken down, it starts to make more sense. So this figure is from a paper that was written several years ago by a group of authors. And basically what they wanted to do, the title, if you can't read it there, is An Analysis of Southeastern U.S. Prescribed Burn Weather Windows, okay? So what they wanted to look at is seasonally, what are the number of burn days where A, I could actually be issued a permit to burn, so conditions are adequate that a permit would be issued, and B, that the weather conditions are conducive to conducting prescribed fire in most of the upland areas that we commonly burn. And so the first major trend or major finding that I want you to focus on is that starting out each year, we have somewhere on average about 90 days that fit those criteria that are in the burn window, okay? And you'll notice that, seasonally there's definitely this trend, and there's a good reason that we conduct most of our prescribed fire in January, February, and March, because there tends to be a peak in suitable burn days during that time of the year. What a lot of people aren't as aware of, or they don't think about as much, is there's also a peak later on in the year in October, November, December. And we don't see that burn window being taken advantage of quite as often. But that being said, I'm sure many of you in here are turkey hunters, or you intentionally manage your property for turkeys. So with that in mind, what's the first window of the year that you typically try to avoid burning? During the hunting season, which also coincides with what? What are turkeys doing during that time of the year? They're nesting, right? So we want to generally avoid burning properties managed for turkeys during the nesting season. All right, so let's go ahead and take that period off the map, off the table. All right, so now we've gone from about 90 days a year in the burn window to about 70 days, okay? A lot of people, as was just mentioned, also don't want to burn during hunting season. So we don't burn during deer season. Oftentimes we don't burn during turkey season as well. So if we go ahead and take those days out, now we're down from 60 to 30, about 29 days in the burn window. So we've already reduced our number of available burn days by 2/3. Most of us, most of you guys are landowners. Most of us have day jobs. We're not, burning for a living, although I'm sure there's some folks here that are. But we only have, or maybe more often than not, we have weekends that are available to us from a time perspective to be able to burn. So if we take out those weekdays, we're now down to about 8 days in the burn window per year where we have those suitable weather conditions and we're not avoiding burning for other reasons like turkey nesting, deer hunting, or turkey hunting. Well, July and August, might as well go ahead and throw those out, right? I mean, there's very few burn days to begin with. In addition to that, most people aren't interested in standing next to flames when it's already, 90 degrees and 90% humidity outside, even if you can get something to light up. So now we're down to about 6 days in the burn window. Well, we're in the South, right? Everybody loves football. So let's go ahead and take our Saturdays out in September. We had, September was the only untouched month we had at this point, but we got football games on Saturdays. And then if you're an NFL fan, you've got the Super Bowl in February. So now we're down to about 3 days in the burn window, okay? So I'm being a little bit facetious here, but the overall point that I'm accurately conveying is that there are all sorts of reasons why we tend to limit ourselves in terms of our burn window. Many of us already recognize that we have difficulty accomplishing the acres that we're trying to get done in a year. So it's time to start thinking a little bit non-traditionally to try to open that burn window up and get more acres in and in turn benefit wildlife. So that's really what I want to focus on now is how can we use various information to our advantage in better establishing how we can meet objectives through prescribed fire by applying it during certain times of the year or on different return intervals. So starting out, one of the main focuses that I want to spend some time on is growing season fire. And believe it or not, in the peer-reviewed literature, the scientific journals, there's not a whole lot of really good, solid information on plant community responses, and especially species-specific habitat responses to growing season fire. But that being said, there have been a handful of really good studies, and one of them was done by Glitzenstein and others. He was a scientist that has conducted all kinds of prescribed burning research across the Southeast. And this particular project took place in Tallahassee, Florida, in and around Tall Timbers Research Station, if y'all are familiar with that area. The study area was primarily longleaf pine savanna, and it was a data set that was quite long in duration. They collected data from 1980 to 2004. So they had about a 24-year data set there, which is really, really impressive for any kind of research project, much less one on prescribed fire. One aspect of their experimental design that they included that I think makes it interesting, and as you'll see in a minute, there's differential responses depending on soil type. And so they actually contrasted plant community responses in dry sandhills, which are probably more representative of some of your properties, compared to pine flatwoods, which I don't know how many people in here have pine flatwoods, but I would expect that the results of those pine flatwoods would somewhat convey over to soils with higher moisture content and maybe heavier clay. So throughout this study, they maintained a 2-year fire return interval regardless of which season a particular plot was assigned to be burned during. Okay, so let's start out by looking at the woody plant response. So how many people, just initially, before you even look at these figures, would have anticipated better woody plant control from burning during the growing season versus the dormant season? I would have. I certainly fit into that category. But their data really didn't show that there was a distinct difference in the metric that they're actually looking here, which is the woody biomass of hardwood saplings in the understory from burning during the growing season versus burning during the dormant season. Now, one important thing to keep in mind with this is when we're thinking about wildlife habitat, we're oftentimes trying to provide specific habitat requirements, whether that be forage or cover, during a specific time of the year to meet a seasonal need for a species. So just to simplify it, let's think about like turkey nesting or turkey brood rearing, for example. That's a seasonal specific resource need. So just because you're not necessarily reducing the woody plant response over time by burning during the growing season, which for those of you that maybe are having a hard time reading from the back, that's this top figure. So they called it lightning season fire, so this was May July, and August compared to dormant season fires, which were November, January, February. So although you may not necessarily reduce that woody plant biomass in the understory over time by burning during that growing season, it is important to also distinguish that from we may be providing areas that are less woody dominated and more dominated by grasses and forbs during the time of the year that it matters by burning during a specific time, by burning during a specific window. I hope that makes sense to y'all. So now let's move on to grass response. And this is a very different story, as you can immediately see. So once again, we've got growing season fire, May, July, and August on this top figure. And as you can see, the understory grass decreases significantly over time in areas that are burned on a 2-year cycle during the growing season. If you contrast that with the time of year where most of us are burning during the dormant season, the grass biomass in the understory stays relatively consistent over time. So to me, when I'm thinking specifically about managing for deer and turkeys, which are both species that aren't very dependent on native warm season grasses, I can use this information to my advantage. So maybe I have a site that I'm traditionally, historically burning during the dormant season because it's easier to burn during that time of the year. You've got more good burn days. But it could be that over time I start building up my grass density to the point where maybe I have 50, 60, 70% coverage of broom sedge in the understory, right? Since some of that broom sedge is good, it's great at carrying fire, quail are gonna nest in it, but deer and turkeys don't need more than about 30 or 40% coverage of grass. And both of those species are primarily just using the grass for cover. They're not feeding on that grass. Deer aren't eating native warm season grasses. Turkeys, maybe they'll take the seeds every now and then. But what I would prefer for habitat managers, landowners to focus more on is providing forbs. So when I say forb, all I mean is just wildflowers, right? So just think of broadleaf plants that are not grasses, they're not woody plants. It's basically a catch-all term that includes everything in the middle. So those showy wildflowers, they're great seed producers. They offer fantastic high-protein deer forage during the summertime, many of them higher than a lot of the food plot species we plant, like clover. They may, in some cases, even rival the protein content of soybeans, and they can be very conducive to increasing habitat quality and increasing reproduction, antler size, clutch size, brood survival, all those types of things. So with that knowledge, if I have a site where I do need to decrease grass density because grass coverage has become too high, I can use this knowledge that burning during the growing season is likely to reduce that grass density. So now we move on to forbs, and I just mentioned forbs. They included both forbs and sedges in their data set, but I want to primarily focus on the forb response. There was not a significant difference in the forb response from burning during the winter versus the growing season. If you just look at the flat wood sites, so those are the higher soil moisture sites. But the higher drier sites and the sand hills, there was a strong positive trend in the increase of forbs for those sites that were burned during the growing season. And they hypothesized, they thought, the authors of the paper and actually what they wrote was that they think that part of the reason for that response is that burning during the growing season is decreasing the grass coverage and allowing more of those beneficial forbs to move in. So it's basically just like a carrying capacity of the understory. It can only support so many plants, and so by timing your burning during different times of the year, you're giving one group of plants versus another a competitive advantage. All right, so now what we really care about, I've already touched on this a little bit, the important part is how do these align with deer and turkey habitat requirements? So I'm going to kind of give you a quick sampling, hit a couple wave tops relatively quickly for each species, and then if there's more questions and we have time, I'm happy to answer those at the end. So starting out, the first thing I want to talk about is nesting cover for turkeys. And so if there's one thing that I would want you guys to leave this talk with, one piece of information that I'd want you to take away from it today, it's that nesting and brooding cover, particularly brooding cover, which I'll talk about intensively in just a minute, are probably the most limiting factor for turkey populations in the Southeast right now. And there's some research results that just came out that really exemplify how important these early successional vegetation communities are for turkeys in particular. And if you look range-wide throughout the southeast, the main problem that we're seeing with turkeys declining is that they're not producing enough poults. This plays directly into increasing nest success and brood survival to fix that reproduction problem. All right, so the study was done by University of Tennessee researchers Dave Bueller and Craig Harper. Many of you that are into the wildlife habitat management game have probably heard of Craig Harper many, many times before. So like I said, they're at the University of Tennessee. Their study site was in South Middle Tennessee, right across the northern Alabama border. And it encompassed a 5-county area in that part of the state. So this is a huge study site, right? 5 counties. They found in that study that less than 10%, single-digit proportion of the landscape was in forb or shrub-dominated plant communities that are conducive to turkey nesting and brood rearing. We don't know exactly how much they need, but I would guess that 7, 8, 9%, probably too little. And look at the next bullet point, if you can read it. The turkeys are telling us what they need. Nearly 50% of the hens in that study, and they had over 400 tagged hens. They had over 400 tagged hens, and nearly half of those hens nested in that single-digit proportion of the landscape. Strong, strong selection. And there was a reason for that. Jump down to that third bullet point. The nest success there was 2 times greater than it was in the surrounding forest. You know, the site was primarily dominated in this part of the country by closed canopy mature hardwood that's probably not receiving any prescribed fire. The factor that they found that was most influential on nest success was the visual obstructions. That's basically, you know, if you look at the plants from a turkey's point of view, so, you know, get down on one knee and you look through there, how dense that is the #1 factor that affected nest success. We want high density of vegetation at turkey height to conceal the hen in her nest. And that was the most important factor. And in fact, this is a photo from one of their nest sites, and that hen's nest was right in this little opening amongst all this other shrubby, viney vegetation. So, we talked about excluding the nesting season from our burn prescription. There have been a couple of projects that have focused on what is the relative risk of burning turkey nests by using prescribed fire during the nesting season, and what they have generally found is that it's fairly limited, because by the time, oftentimes when we think about setting an area back because it's grown, the vegetation in the understory has grown too high or too dense, and by the time we start thinking about putting a fire in it again, hens aren't even using it to nest in anymore because it's become too thick. So specifically, to phrase that another way, the vast majority of hens, and this isn't just from Tennessee, this is from data in Louisiana, South Carolina, Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, the vast majority of hens are not nesting in areas that have been burned more than 2 years prior. So if you're going to a 3-year burn rotation, year 3 comes up, you're going to burn, and let's say that you weren't able for whatever reason to get your burning done during the dormant season, maybe push on into the nesting season and burn that plot so that you can go ahead and reset it and make it usable space for turkeys. It'll actually become good brooding cover in that given year, and you probably did not burn up that many nests in the process of doing it based on our data that shows, you know, where hens select to nest. As I mentioned a moment ago, we're not exactly sure how much of a property should be in brooding and nesting cover. We haven't directly quantified that in a study by looking at properties with different composition to find out which one maximizes reproduction, but it's generally agreed upon by most biologists that you should shoot for about 25, 30%, somewhere in that range, to maximize turkey production if that's your objective. One other thing that we should think about when it comes to nesting cover is how close is it to brooding cover, okay? So when we think about nesting cover, we're thinking primarily about a woody-dominated understory that maybe is at belt height down to knee height to offer concealment for the hen in her nest, whereas when we think about brooding cover, we're thinking about a much shorter vegetation community that's primarily dominated by those forbs, those wildflowers. So it's much more open, maybe even have some bare ground at ground level to make it easier for them to scratch around and feed. But we want high coverage of those forbs because they attract the insects that the turkey poults are dependent on. 90% of their diet is going to be insects during those first couple of weeks of life. And if they don't get as many insects as they need, they're not going through their feather molting process as fast, so they're not gaining the ability to fly as quickly, and that makes them more susceptible to predation. So we want to make sure that when that hen hatches off her nest, she's got brooding cover nearby, because the further the distance, and we've shown this with research, the further that they have to travel from where they nest to where they brood, survival is going to go down over that whole distance. So the further they travel, we've even documented hens moving with their broods up to a mile and a half over a several-day period. That entire that entire brood oftentimes gets completely wiped out by the time they arrive on the brooding grounds. So we want to make sure that they don't have to move more than maybe a couple hundred yards instead. All right, so I already talked about this a little bit, but I really wanted to hone in and show you all some examples of what I think of when I think about brooding cover for turkeys. Most of these areas are going to be those that have been burned within the past year. This is a very early successional stage where it's dominated by a lot of annual wildflowers, annual forbs. So it's dominated by forbs. We got bare ground, average height of vegetation, boot to knee high. And based on those figures that we looked at just a minute ago with that data on growing versus dormant season fire, we can use that information to glean that growing season fire can be instrumental to manage for this cover type, because it reduces grass while stimulating forbs concurrently. So it's achieving both of those objectives of improving the brooding cover for turkeys within that area. So here's a few more images. I wish that the screen that I could project these on was bigger to give you a little bit better idea, but hopefully some of you in the front are able to get a pretty good concept or idea of what that looks like. But the main takeaway, and these will be posted online, Lee has assured me, so you could go back and look at it later once those are posted. But you can see that in each of these examples, here we're looking from the top down. We've got lots of open space between those plants, and you can see the soil between them. So that's critical to enabling those poults to efficiently move throughout the area, still have overhead cover from hawks, right? Especially from those aerial predators, and they can easily acquire all the insect food resources that they need. In addition to that, one thing that is becoming increasingly clear is that we're losing a lot of poults to their lack of ability to thermoregulate, basically maintain body temperature early in life. And what happens when you walk out through a dense area, or like a dense field that's dominated by grass in the early morning? What happens to your boots? They get wet, right? So a wet poult that has not even gone through its first molting cycle, that gets those, they grow in those feathers that protect them better from the weather. If they're walking through dense grass instead of an open forb community like this, they get wet, they get cold, and then they die. Another benefit of fire when it comes to turkeys became readily apparent actually just a few weeks ago. So there was a study that was published out of the University of Florida. They actually weren't even interested in turkeys or turkey predators, but instead what they were looking at is how do different fire prescriptions in northern Florida, up in the Panhandle, affect mammal communities. Well, it just so happens that a lot of the mammal communities, particularly like raccoons, possums, I don't have a picture of a fox up here, but foxes, of course, as well, and several others, tend to be turkey nest predators, right? So we can glean some valuable insight from that study on how fire not only potentially benefits turkeys from a habitat perspective, but it can even diminish the habitat quality for their predators. Are we already out of time? Yes. Okay. So I'll finish this up really quickly. So the take-home point here is that the detection of turkey predators decreased by about 70% when you go from an area that was unburned to an area that was burned every 2 years. So the point is, concurrently, fire is decreasing habitat quality for nest predators and increasing habitat quality for turkeys. Deer benefit from fire too. Overall nutritional carrying capacity, the amount of deer that an area will support over a given period of time, is going to be greatest in areas that are burned about every 3 to 4 years. But if you want to maximize summer nutrition in an area for turkeys, for deer, you probably are going to want to burn it very similarly to how you do for turkeys, about every 2 years. So burning every 2 years, again, stimulates that forb community, and those forbs have high protein content that supports body growth, antler growth, and lactation during the summertime. So for the sake of time, I'll skip over those last couple, but if this is something that interests you and you would like to hear a more deep dive discussion on it with a little bit more nuance, I'm co-host of a podcast named the Wild Turkey Science Podcast. If you've never listened to a podcast, you can kind of think of it as a book on tape. It's a great way to passively learn and listen. And so if you just Google Wild Turkey Science Podcast, you should be able to click on the link and go through and see all the episodes. They're numbered and titled. And I've pointed out some particular episodes that touch very heavily on these topics that I've mentioned today.